Oh my God. Get down! Get down!
October 17th, 2023, 9:47 in the morning. A man in a custom-tailored suit worth more than most people earn in a month stood in the Providence Municipal Court. Within the next 45 seconds, this police chief would pull a loaded weapon on Judge Frank Caprio in front of a room full of witnesses. But there was something in the case file that morning, something specific about the complainant's story that made what happened almost predictable. The charge on paper looked simple enough. Case number 2023, TR 8847, a traffic violation. What nobody in that courtroom understood yet was that this wasn't about a speeding ticket. This was about a man who had spent 2 decades building a fortress of authority around himself, convinced that his position made him immune to the rules everyone else had to follow. You're probably thinking you know how this story goes. You don't. I am Frederick, and I've spent years examining courtroom cases where power collides with accountability. What unfolded that morning in Providence was a complete breakdown of someone who had never learnt the difference between authority and immunity. If you want to see how this unfolds step by step, hit the like button right now, because the details get more unbelievable with every minute. The defendant that morning was Richard Vandermeer, 52 years old, police chief of Westbrook. Westbrook was one of those places where the median home price started around $800,000. Vandermeer came from old money, the kind that gets passed down through generations. His grandfather had made a fortune in commercial real estate back in the 1950s. Richard became a cop, not because he needed the paycheck, but because he liked the authority that came with the badge. By the time he made chief, his annual salary was $185,000, but that was pocket change compared to his family wealth. He drove a customized Cadillac Escalade worth over $95,000. His watch collection alone was valued at more than $500,000. People who worked under him described someone who genuinely believed that rules were flexible guidelines that increased based on your position in the social hierarchy. The complainant was Officer Maria Santos, 34 years old, single mother of 2 daughters, ages 6 and 8. Maria had served 2 full combat tours in Afghanistan as a military police officer. She came home, joined the Providence Police Department 7 years ago, and worked the night shift so she could be home during the day with her girls. Her oldest daughter, Emma, had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 2 years earlier. The medical bills were crushing. Maria worked every overtime shift she could get, picked up extra security details, anything to keep money coming in. Her fellow officers said she was the kind of person who would split her last meal with you if you were hungry, who never made excuses and never complained about the hand life had dealt her. When I first read about Officer Santos, something struck me that stayed with me through this whole story. Here was someone doing everything society tells you you're supposed to do. Serve your country, work hard, sacrifice for your family, play by the rules. And life was still hitting her with everything it had. That's the part that matters when you understand what happened next. Because courage doesn't come from having nothing to lose. Real courage comes from having everything to lose and doing the right thing anyway. On September 22nd, 2023, at approximately 11:34 at night, these 2 worlds crashed into each other on Route 95, and everything that followed became inevitable. Officer Santos was working her regular patrol route that Tuesday night. Route 95 northbound, the stretch that cut through Providence into the wealthier suburbs. Around 11:34 p.m., her radar clocked a black Cadillac Escalade doing 97 miles per hour in a 65 zone. She activated her lights near exit 18. The Escalade didn't pull over right away. It kept driving for another 1.5 miles before finally stopping on the shoulder. That was already a warning sign. Maria approached the vehicle with standard caution. When she reached the driver's window, she immediately recognized Police Chief Richard Vandermeer from Westbrook. He was wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than she made in 2 months. His wrist displayed a watch that caught the light, something worth more than her annual salary. Maria kept her tone professional and respectful. She asked for his license and registration. Vandermeer looked at her badge, then at her face. What came out of his mouth wasn't anger exactly. It was the casual contempt of someone who genuinely believed he was talking to an inferior. He told her she was a nobody cop from a nobody department. He suggested she should get back in her patrol car and pretend this encounter never happened. Maria stayed calm. She explained that she had clocked him at 97 miles per hour and needed to see his documentation. Vandermeer laughed. Actually laughed right in her face. Then he said something that crossed a line most people wouldn't even know existed. He mentioned that medical bills for a sick child must be incredibly expensive. He said it would be a real shame if she lost her job and her health insurance over making a big deal out of nothing. He said Emma's name, her daughter's actual name. There are moments in these stories where I have to pause and think about the kind of calculation that goes into a threat like that. The cold-blooded strategy it takes to weaponize a mother's fear for her sick child, to use a 6-year-old's cancer diagnosis as leverage in a traffic stop that reveals something fundamentally broken in how someone views other human beings. Maria's hands were shaking when she pulled out her citation book. She filled out the ticket: excessive speed, failure to yield to an emergency vehicle, reckless driving. She handed it to Vandermeer through the window. He took it, looked at it for 2 seconds, then tore it in half. Right in front of her, he tore it again into quarters, rolled down his window completely, and threw the pieces out onto the highway. Then he drove away. Maria stood there watching his taillights disappear. She could have let it go right then. Nobody would have blamed her, but instead, she walked along the shoulder, collecting every torn piece of that ticket. She photographed them. She documented everything. Then she spent the next 20 minutes writing the most detailed incident report of her career. 2 days later, Captain Robert Chen called her into his office. Chen was 28 years on the force, old school in the best way possible. He told her that someone from Westbrook had been making phone calls. Someone with connections had reached out to people higher up the chain. There was pressure to make this ticket situation disappear quietly. Chen asked if she wanted to pursue it. He told her he would back her either way, but she needed to understand what she was getting into. Maria told Captain Chen she wanted to pursue it through the courts. She said it clearly, without hesitation. Chen nodded and promised he would stand with her no matter what pressure came down from above. Quick question for you watching this right now. If you were Officer Santos in that moment, knowing you had a sick child at home, knowing this man had connections and money and the willingness to destroy you, would you have pushed forward with the case? Drop a comment and let me know, because what she did next took more courage than most of us will ever need to find in our entire lives. Meanwhile, Richard Vandermeer wasn't worried at all. He had made bigger problems disappear with a few phone calls, and the right amount of pressure applied to the right people. He hired Gregory Ashford, a private attorney from Boston, who specialized in making wealthy people's legal problems vanish. Ashford's retainer started at $50,000, and his track record spoke for itself. Vandermeer expected this whole situation to be handled quietly. What he didn't expect was Judge Frank Caprio. Caprio had been on the bench for over 4 decades with a reputation for 2 specific things. First, he gave people second chances when they deserved them. Second, he absolutely did not tolerate disrespect, corruption, or attempts to game the system. October 17, 2023, Vandermeer walked into the Providence Municipal Court at 9:45 a.m. He wore another expensive suit, probably $6,000. His shoes were Beluti, another $2,000. Everything about his appearance screamed wealth and status. Gregory Ashford walked beside him, carrying a slim folder. They looked like they were heading to a minor inconvenience, not a legal proceeding that could actually affect anything meaningful. Officer Maria Santos sat in the gallery wearing her dress uniform, combat action badge from Afghanistan, Army Achievement Medal, Providence Police Department commendations. She sat with her hands folded, back straight, eyes focused forward, professional and dignified. But if you look closely, you could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from working double shifts and spending nights in hospital rooms. Judge Caprio called the case at exactly 9:47 a.m. Attorney Ashford stood first, smooth and practiced. Vandermeer stood beside him, but not in the way most defendants stand in a courtroom. He stood like he was doing everyone a favor by being there. His posture communicated that he didn't consider himself subject to the same rules as regular people. There's a specific kind of arrogance that comes from never facing real consequences for anything. It's the absolute certainty that the rules bend around you, that accountability is for other people. Judge Caprio had been on the bench long enough to recognize it immediately. Judge Caprio asked Officer Santos to present her testimony. She described everything exactly as it happened: the radar reading of 97 miles per hour, the delayed stop, the initial conversation. She provided radar gun calibration records and dash camera footage. Everything documented perfectly. When she described how Vandermeer had mentioned her daughter's medical bills, how he had used Emma's name specifically, her voice cracked, just slightly, just for half a second. She paused, took a breath, composed herself, and continued. Then it was Vandermeer's turn to speak. Attorney Ashford started to address the court, but Vandermeer waved him off, actually waved his own lawyer aside, like swatting away an insect. He addressed Judge Caprio directly. He said the radar gun must have been wrong. He suggested that Officer Santos must have misread the equipment, probably because she was distracted thinking about her personal problems. He said this with a smirk, an actual smirk on his face, while a mother sat 15 feet away. Judge Caprio asked a simple, direct question. Did he threaten Officer Santos regarding her employment and her daughter's health insurance? Vandermeer didn't even pause. He said he may have mentioned that making false accusations against a police chief could have professional consequences for her career, like threatening a woman's sick child was just normal business practice. Attorney Ashford's face went completely pale. His client had just confessed to witness intimidation in open court, but Vandermeer kept going. He said Judge Caprio needed to understand that people in positions of authority deserved certain courtesies. He mentioned his connections to the mayor, to state legislators. He was still threatening people right there in the courtroom. What's fascinating about moments like this is watching someone dig their own grave with absolute confidence. Vandermeer thought he was negotiating from a position of strength. He had no idea he was building the case against himself with every word. Judge Caprio stood up from his bench. He told Vandermeer he was finding him guilty on all charges: excessive speed, failure to yield, reckless driving, destruction of a traffic citation. But more than that, he was referring the case to federal authorities for investigation of witness intimidation and abuse of power. Vandermeer's face changed. Something that looked almost like panic appeared, like the first recognition that this might not go his way. Then something in him snapped. He reached into his jacket. People who were there said time seemed to slow down. He pulled out a Glock 19 9mm handgun. He pointed it directly at Judge Caprio. The courtroom went absolutely silent for one frozen second. The court bailiffs moved immediately. Senior bailiff Marcus Thompson, a former Marine with 15 years as a court bailiff, came at Vandermeer from the side angle. Bailiff Jennifer Martinez moved from the other direction, with her weapon drawn but didn't fire. Vandermeer's hand was shaking. He was shouting something about respect, about his position. Officer Santos had instinctively moved to shield civilians in the gallery. Judge Caprio stood completely still, looked directly at Vandermeer, and spoke calmly. He told him to put the weapon down, that this would only make things worse. Bailiff Thompson reached Vandermeer in the 38th second. He grabbed Vandermeer's gun hand, forcing it upward and away from Judge Caprio. Bailiff Martinez secured his other arm. The weapon clattered to the floor in the 42nd. Vandermeer was face down on the courtroom floor in the 44th second. Handcuffs closed around his wrists in the 45th second. From weapon drawn to completely in custody, exactly 45 seconds. Nobody was hurt. No shots were fired, but everything had changed. I try to imagine what goes through someone's mind in those 45 seconds. Not Vandermeer. His choices make a sick kind of sense. But Judge Caprio, standing there with a loaded weapon pointed at him, staying calm enough to try to talk the situation down, that's a different category of courage. Richard Vandermeer was charged immediately with assault on a judicial officer with a deadly weapon. That's a federal crime, automatic FBI involvement. But the FBI had actually been watching Vandermeer for 8 months already. His name had come up in a broader corruption investigation into municipal police departments. What happened in Judge Caprio's courtroom just accelerated everything. Former officers from Westbrook PD started coming forward. They described years of systematic corruption under Vandermeer's leadership. How he ran the department like his personal protection service. How DIRS disappeared for wealthy friends. How he used his badge to intimidate business owners into paying protection money. Federal investigators found unreported bank accounts, deposits from construction companies, cash payments that lined up with dismissed charges against wealthy defendants. The corruption went back almost 2 decades. The trial took place 6 months later in federal court. Judge Patricia Morrison presiding. The evidence was overwhelming. Former officers testified. Business owners described the protection money. Financial experts showed the money trails. And there was the courtroom video. The jury watched Richard Vandermeer pull a loaded weapon on Judge Frank Caprio in complete silence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all 37 federal counts. Guilty on all state charges. When the verdict was read, Vandermeer showed no emotion. He just stared straight ahead. Judge Morrison sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. He would be 70 years old before he was eligible for parole. His pension was revoked, his law enforcement certification permanently stripped, all assets connected to criminal activity were seized. The house, the cars, the watch collection, everything gone. This is what happens when the system finally works the way it's supposed to. If you want to see more stories about accountability, actually catching up with people who thought they were untouchable, subscribe right now because I've got plenty more cases where justice eventually arrived, even when it seemed impossible. Officer Maria Santos received a commendation for bravery from the Providence Police Department. The FBI gave her a civilian citation for her cooperation. 6 months after the trial, she was promoted to sergeant. The police union and community organizations raised over $200,000 for Emma's medical bills. Emma was doing better. She had been in remission for 8 months. She was back in school, playing soccer, being a regular kid. Her mother came home after her shifts, knowing she had done the right thing. What happened in that Providence courtroom was about what happens when ordinary people refuse to back down. Officer Santos was exhausted, scared, financially struggling, facing threats against her sick child. Every rational calculation told her to let it go, and she fought anyway. She stood firm on principle, even when principle could have cost her everything. 18 years is a long time to think about the choices you made. Vandermeer had spent 2 decades believing he was untouchable. Now he had 2 decades ahead of him to understand he never was. I am Frederick, and I've studied hundreds of cases where power collided with accountability. Most of them don't end like this one. Most of the time the system fails. People with money and connections avoid real consequences. That's what makes this story matter. Not because it's common, but because it proves what's possible when people make the hard choice. Richard Vandermeer thought his position made him special, and for 20 years he was right, until he met someone who believed in her duty more than she feared his threats. That's the real story, not the dramatic arrest or the satisfying sentence. The story is about Officer Maria Santos making a choice when it would have been easier to walk away, about Judge Caprio standing firm when someone with a loaded weapon tried to make him back down. Justice doesn't happen automatically just because we have laws and courts. Justice happens because people choose to make it happen. Every single day we all face that choice, whether to stand up for what's right or look the other way, whether to hold people accountable or make excuses for them because of their wealth or position. Those choices matter more than we realize. Because the courtroom might be where these battles end, but they start every time someone with power tries to abuse it, and every time an ordinary person decides to say no.